Okay. All right. Good afternoon. Welcome back to AfPIF3. This is the first panel session we have under the theme Terrestrial Capacity from Cape Town to Cairo, Reality or Illusion. Now, the reason we thought through this theme was because that we were trying in the last two AfPIFs to try and get regional interconnection taking place. And one of the challenges we realized was that in every country we went to, there was a discussion ongoing or projects ongoing where governments are talking huge about how they're building thousands of kilometers of cable. Every country I've been to in Africa, there is a government project funded either by the Chinese, you name it, World Bank, thousands of kilometers of cable. But the interesting thing is that they only build it up to the border point and they walk away. Nobody interconnects. They just build it, leave it at the border point and walk away. So, and I've seen a lot of projects. I think there's one currently sponsored being done by Steve Song to try and map how much terrestrial fiber exists in various parts of Africa across. And you'll see even what they've mapped in addition to what the governments have been able to build, plus what the private sector has built. It's huge. But when it gets to the borders, it's not particularly clear how it actually crosses the border or who is responsible for connecting that border point. So in the discussions, we realized that unless it's going to landlocked countries where there was some sense of interconnection, of some ongoing efforts to try and interconnect the countries that are landlocked so that they can get access to the submarine cables. Interconnection across border points, especially countries that don't really need to have that interconnection because they have access to the sea. And I'll give an example like Kenya and Tanzania that have access to the sea. That interconnection doesn't exist, but we have fiber to the border points perfectly. And as you keep going south, the same thing tends to happen. So we try to understand what is the challenge, what's going on. And in the process, we realized that essentially right now to interconnect all of Africa, and in this case in point, from Cape Town to Cairo, the only way you can do so is through submarine cables. Terrestrially, in as much as there's thousands of kilometers of cable to almost every other border point, all the way from south to north, it is almost impossible to actually send a packet right up terrestrially. Now, we want to identify where is this challenge from a regulatory point of view. Now, with me, I have a panel here, the first panel, which is going to discuss this issue, landlocked countries and cross-border regulatory realities, what's really happening. I have 5 panelists. The first panelist is Mr. Michael Kende. Mr. Michael Kende is a partner and head of the policy and regulatory sector at Analysys Mason. And before joining Analysys Mason, he was director of internet policy and analyst at the FCC. And he has a very good resume, so I'll not read all of it. The role he plays here is that he's had the opportunity to do a lot of work, not just in Africa, but around the world, and on some of the key issues when it comes to interconnection and cross-border regulation. And in particular, he was involved in a protocol that that was signed in 2008. Is it 2008, the Kigali Protocol in 2008, where governments actually agreed to interconnect across borders. But the question is, that was 2008. This is 2012. What has really happened in that time frame? So in addition to that, we have another set of another speaker, Eddy Kayihura, from Broadband Systems Corporation in Rwanda. Eddy, he's a CTO. He's been involved with the exchange point. He's been involved with the CCTLD. He's been involved in the infrastructure development. And it will be of interest to hear what challenges is Rwanda facing trying to interconnect to the submarine cable. We also have Dr. Paulos Nyirenda from Malawi, similar experience, landlocked country in Southern Africa, working with the exchange point, working with the CCTLD and the community in developing interconnection. What challenges are they facing with interconnection? And then would also like to hear the challenges that SEACOM has faced in trying to cross borders. We had them during the opening session talk about trying to seamlessly get to as close to the people as possible. But they have to cross borders as a result. What's their challenge in trying to get there? And with that, we'll have Suveer Ramdhani as one of the panelists. And finally, we will have a view from what is happening in Europe. What can we learn from the Europeans? How have they managed to make their interconnection seamless? Because as far as I'm meant to understand is that you buy circuits, it's not because you're crossing the border and the price changes. It's a point-to-point circuit. So buying from one city to the other, crossing the borders are seamless, so to speak, in Europe when it comes to buying capacity. So what can we learn from a policy, regulatory point of view, and also from a business point of view? So without further ado, I'd like to invite Michael Kende with the opening presentation to tee us up for the discussions. Welcome.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak here at this event. Just by way of introduction, Analysys Mason is a strategy consulting company. We do work globally. We've been doing quite a bit of work in Africa recently, and in fact, we're in the process of opening up an office here in Johannesburg. So a lot of what I'm going to present comes from work that we've been doing here, as well as elsewhere in the world, and discussions we've been having with clients about challenges with respect to these issues and others. At a personal level, I recently had the privilege of working with the Internet Society on the paper on the benefit of Internet exchange points in Kenya and Nigeria that Karen mentioned this morning, and I think there's still copies available. I'll talk about it a bit more tomorrow at the session that's devoted to that. But with respect to this, it really drove home the need to have lower costs for terrestrial bandwidth, both within countries and cross-border, in order to help exploit and help use the IXPs and have them grow and localize more traffic within Africa. So this is a map that many of you may have seen, so I won't spend too much time on it, but starting with what's been changing, the noticeable growth in the last few years, this map shows all the cables that are active, in the process of going active and planned out to next year. And if you just add up the numbers for the West Coast and East Coast, not even including the one that's going online next year, but just through this year, you get to 25 terabits of submarine cable capacity serving sub-Saharan Africa. A significant amount, huge increase in the past 5-10 years. And then if you take it down to something more tangible, if you look at the numbers from telegeography, in 2001 there was 1.21 gigabits of international internet bandwidth from all African countries, connecting all African countries, which has grown from that to 570 last year. So huge growth in the amount, although relatively speaking it may not be enough certainly, but a huge growth in the past 10 years, partly driven by all this new cable capacity that's come on in the past couple of years. From a study that we did recently, we've looked at how the cost of providing broadband breaks down depending on how it's delivered. And so on the top graph, you can see that if you're using satellite capacity or very expensive monopoly-provided submarine capacity, 50% of the cost of providing broadband would be just for the international connectivity. And then the rest is broken down accordingly. And then if you move to competitive submarine cable connectivity, your cost of providing broadband for a hypothetical operator that we modeled would drop by half, and particularly that sliver, the top half on the graph on the right, the international connectivity goes down from a huge amount, or half of the cost, down to a very small amount of the cost. So this is based on some work we did last year, and if you see me afterwards, if you want the whole presentation that shows these breakdowns of costs, I'd be happy to, if you give me a card, I'd be happy to send that to you. This is just the relevant parts for this. So one more map. This shows the number of cables landing in each country in 2012 in Africa, ranging from none to the darkest one being 5 or 6 cables landing in a country. And the first thing that you can't see from this is the huge improvements just since 2010. 7 new countries have submarine cables landing in the country just since 2010. And 11 have at least one more cable than landed 2 years ago. So 18 countries have seen a significant benefit out of all of these new cables landing. But now if I can pivot over to the topic of this presentation, the terrestrial cross-border capacity, you can see the issue. 16 countries are landlocked, the blue ones, and this is a map from last year, so South Sudan doesn't show up, but that would be the 16th. So a significant number of landlocked countries, obviously with no, by definition, no submarine cable landing stations. A couple of the countries that are on the coast have no submarine connections, and another 10 rely on only 1 or 2 landing cables landing, so may not have the optimal amount of competition available. So this highlights the need for the terrestrial cross-border connections. Looking at some more numbers, the last set we could find on spending was for 2010, showing that on terrestrial capacity, $12 billion had either been spent, was in the process of being spent, or was being proposed for cross-border cables. So a significant amount of money, and that's 2 years ago. And you can see the impact of that more tangibly in the graph on the right, with the amount of cross-border internet bandwidth going from virtually nothing in 2005 up to, growing quite quickly through 2011 to 30,000 megabits per second. And putting in these networks in place has significant benefits for the countries. I'll just list a few here. It provides access to the submarine cables for the landlocked countries so that the ISPs in those countries can benefit from the reduction in cost of moving from satellite to submarine cable to provide the international connectivity. Even if you do live in a coastal country, and even if you do have a landing station, being able to go to another coastal country to use their landing station adds redundancy, which is important when the cable's cut, but also increases your competitive options. If your country has a relatively restrictive landing station, you can go to the next country, pick up capacity there, and lower your prices. In terms of the IXPs, it helps IXPs to be able to provide cross-border services to ISPs in other countries to make their content available, and starts hopefully a virtuous cycle of growth where the more people that can access the content in the IXP, the more content will arrive there to serve those customers. And that will also help to reduce international tromboning and help to build up this African internet that we heard about this morning. I had somebody put together a list, certainly partial list of all of the cables that are being built. And of interest here, there's different models, which is good. One of them, ACE, is a submarine cable, of course, but does provide for some terrestrial links into landlocked countries like Mali and Niger. Others are more, I'd say, in the planning stage, And then the final two are private ones that are starting to be built across country and offer a wholesale model to give access to others. So quite a few long cables being built in the process or actually online today. However, there still remain quite a few challenges. So this pie chart shows the breakdown of where the international internet bandwidth from African countries is going. And the vast majority of it is going to Europe today. 492 out of the 570. The next biggest slice of the pie is to Asia, then to the US and Canada, and finally, setting aside Latin America where there's no capacity, the smallest is international internet bandwidth connecting African countries to each other. And this is from last year for telegeography, and it's obviously both in absolute and relative terms a very small amount of the total capacity. So things that this panel will discuss now steps have to be taken in order to increase the availability and access of this domestic or terrestrial cross-border fiber. And this relates to the cost of deploying the fiber and regulations that are imposing costs and limiting access, such as licensing requirements and others. So as Michuki had mentioned, the Kigali Protocol started being negotiated quite a few years ago, took effect in 2008, and was aiming to promote the development of a network using private and public funds that would have open access provisions guaranteed by the governments to allow all authorized entities to access it, and that's not just licensed ISPs and licensed operators, but academic and other networks that have authorization in that country to offer communication services. However, it hasn't been fully endorsed. Some of the countries, obviously not all African countries are on this list, and some of the countries that were even in the negotiations refused to sign. Others that signed didn't ratify, but in the end a majority did ratify and it took effect. And a few issues have emerged that we could find, and one is a very standard one in these things, that the incumbent operator in a country objected to it, either on grounds of competition or what it would do to their revenues, or maybe a misunderstanding, but there were some objections coming seemingly from the incumbents. And also in the course of this development, the rest of the industry didn't stand still and other alternatives developed that allowed for cross-border traffic. That kind of supplanted the need in some sense for this network. However, the open access principles have been embedded in other cables. There's a big consortium that owns 30% of EASY, including cross-border links that operates under open access. The WAX cable has open access embedded in it. We spoke to a client yesterday who is non-incumbent and was very happy with the provisions and felt that they really benefited them in getting access to capacity, in this case, submarine capacity. So finally, to close, there are still regulatory roadblocks. So every year, the ITU asks every country to indicate which of their sectors within telecommunications have full competition, partial competition, which could be a duopoly or a very limited number of competitors, or full competition. And last year, the answers indicated that 6 African countries have a monopoly still on the international gateway. Obviously, the key part of going cross-border is having permission to go cross-border. And so in 6 countries, only 1 operator was allowed to accept incoming traffic at a gateway, either terrestrial or submarine, of which one of them is landlocked. So clearly their only access was through that landlocked monopolist. 11 have partial competition, of which 4 are landlocked, and 16 have full competition, of which 6 of them are landlocked. Now this obviously doesn't add up to all the African countries, so you have to speculate what's up in the other countries, and your guess is as good as mine, but I would guess that the ones that don't answer this probably haven't fully implemented competition. However, that doesn't tell the whole story. Liberalizing even the international gateway doesn't mean that it can be exploited. The World Bank found one case a couple years ago where there was nominally full competition, but the cost of a license was $12 million, which was very obviously impossible to justify for a nascent industry. So that really effectively limited competition. Or you might have the license, but as Michuki had said, there might be a no man's land or other issues in going cross-border. Maybe on the other side of the border there's no competition and there's no one to link up with, or the negotiations don't go well. So this suggests a few reforms that could take place. First, some general ones. Liberalization, obviously, to allow the most possible companies to provide international gateway services. So that's the first one. The second one is an independent regulator around the world has been proven to be most immune to the lobbying of the incumbent, particularly when the incumbent is still government-owned and there's a revenue impact from liberalization. So those are general reforms that can take place in order to increase the amount of competition. Then you can kind of go on a variety of levels to be able to exploit and create these cross-border networks. The first being, once you've got the license, or once you've liberalized, making sure that it's as cheap as possible to put in a cross-border network by clarifying access to rights-of-ways, making sure that the prices of accessing those rights-of-ways are based on costs and not trying to exploit the networks. The licensing requirements are very important, including allowing non-telcos, particularly utilities that may already have networks or have good rights-of-ways like railroads or electricity companies, allowing them to provide cable without necessarily becoming fully fledged telecom operators is very important because they have networks that they can contribute to a backbone. Then at the service layer, if you like, it's important to allow companies to work across borders once you have the networks in place. For instance, allowing ISPs to pick up traffic capacity or interconnected IXPs in other countries without having to fully license in those countries. In other words, separating offering service in that country from picking up traffic is very important. And that's a way of being able to exploit and grow a regional IXP. And then, and I think this was hinted at in this morning session with Aiden, making sure that companies can, like cloud providers, can provide services across borders is very important. And in many countries, there's data retention issues that come up. So a bank may have requirements to keep all of their data in the country, meaning that they couldn't use a cloud provider at a regional IXP in a neighboring country. And this is not just in Africa. There's issues in Europe, other countries. But that really prevents regional IXPs from growing if they can't host traffic for everyone in the region. So I think that all these layers need to be taken care of, that you need the basic regulations in place, and then you need to lower the cost and increase the ability of companies to exploit the cross-border traffics and build up the IXPs as a way of addressing the issues that we're discussing here. That rounds out the presentation, and I'm looking forward to the other presentations and questions following that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So I'd like to take this opportunity to invite Eddy to tell us what's going on in Rwanda and what's your experience getting through to the submarine cable on the East African side.
The map in his presentation.
Which one?
In my presentation. The landlocked map.
Hmm? Oh, okay.
The previous presentation?
Yeah, there. Just one. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Eddy Kayihura, and I work for Broadband Systems Corporation, which is an ISP in Rwanda. And today I just want to tell you a bit about the story, how it started in Rwanda and how we started experiencing the submarine capacity, though we are a landlocked country. Someone said, I don't know if you'll be able to find Rwanda on that map. It is quite a small country. And someone said that we have to borrow lands in different countries to be able to write the name of our country. It can't fit in the small place. And though it is small, it's a country with a high vision in ICT, and we're trying to do our best there. But there's nothing we can do against being landlocked. We're just in the middle of the land, and the first connection we managed to get was once we managed to get capacity from Uganda, actually. And it was not that complicated for the cross-border because it was actually a microwave. It was a microwave between the last point in Uganda and the first point inside Rwanda. And, well, it's not much regulation around waves. It was just going through. And since then, it was good to have capacity, but, well, it was just an STM1, 155 meg, nothing more. But it was already a huge change because we are coming from the satellite times. And remember, I was working for the biggest ISP back then. And I think we had in total 120 meg in satellite capacity. So having 155 meg and seeing 200 milliseconds to the server out there was a drastic change. And then it evolved. It evolved a lot with Tanzania. TTCL did a lot of work building fiber inside Tanzania, which, if you look at the map, is, someone said, is bigger than East Africa, all the East Africa country altogether. And TTCL is a government-owned company, and crossing the border was not much of a big problem. I checked with the regulator how it happened, and I don't think they did a lot of fancy discussion. There was just exchange of letters between regulators. And then TTCL brought in the fiber to, since they're the one constructing at that period, they took it on them to build for the no man's land. So they're the one who actually crossed the border and meet us. Basically, BSC is managing the government's backbone that was built, and it was built, it was already ready, and connecting to 9 border posts, 3 with Uganda, 3 with Burundi, 2 with Congo, and 1 with Tanzania. But we had no one else coming on the other side of the border, and that was a challenge. You have the fiber, but you can't do anything with it since no one else comes on the other side. And Tanzania was the first one to reach there with the live traffic, and the interconnection was a 10 gig link, which is coming up slowly. But an interesting part of the story was how it happened with Uganda, because in Uganda, there is no open access, and it was not a government entity. It was UTL and MTN and Infocom mainly. Currently, they're the one who have fiber. But at the beginning, the first one who had fiber was UTL. They reached at the border, and then we reached on the other side of the border, and that was it. No one's doing anything. MTN reached the border too from Rwanda, and there was no interconnection between the two countries. There was a lot of discussions, and then according to the record I got from the regulator, they also again discussed, there was a discussion between the two regulators, and I think our regulator has not many issues to put in place because we are landlocked, and we are the one at need, we are the one who needs to have a connection. And eventually, I think it was the first time we had open access or infrastructure sharing. One of the operator put connection between the two sides with a manhole, I think, inside the no man's land. But that was it. There was no traffic going in. We had fiber connection, and the connection through Uganda was still on microwave. The connection through Tanzania was on fiber. Now, one of the things is also the fact that in Uganda there's no open access. You have to understand that if you look at the map, Uganda is also landlocked, but you have Mombasa and the sea, and then Nairobi in the middle of Kenya, and then you have Kampala in the middle of Uganda. Now, once Kampala was connected, I think the Ugandan operator said, that's it. We've connected Kampala. There's no point of going south. Why do I need to go that side? And you'll be surprised that even up to today, it is very challenging to get capacity through Uganda. And to get it when you are not affiliated with one of the big operators or one of the big players inside Uganda. That's the main challenge. So the border is a problem, but Kampala to the border is another challenge. Personally, I've been to Kampala trying to get a quotation for a customer of ours who wanted an STM1 link between Kigali and Kampala. I spent 2 days in Kampala, and we first started with emails, it didn't work. Phone calls, it didn't work. Then my boss said, go there. I went there, I saw all the operators, and I came back with only promises and no quotation. Why? Because you have to understand that when you are having your own operation within Rwanda, you don't want a neutral backbone operator to come to you because you want to benefit your partner in the country. So they just said, yes, we'll give you an offer, and well, up to today, I have not yet received any offer. It was easy with Tanzania in a way, though we thought it was the most complicated part, but being a neutral and they have no interest in Rwanda, they were willing to connect to anyone. So Tanzania connected to BSC, and they also connected to MTN, and I think Rwandatel also got a connection with them. So that was the story about the interconnection from Rwanda. Another activity that is there is the virtual landing station. So we don't have any landing station, so we need to create a virtual one, mainly to break the monopoly that the big players who can reach the sea have. So you'd realize that the small ISPs can only buy undersea capacity from the big players who have partners in Uganda and who can get a contract with TTCL. So under the sponsorship of the World Bank and the government, there was establishment of a virtual landing station. It's not yet finished, but the whole idea behind was to support government to purchase big IRUs and long-term IRUs. And with that, they'll be able to buy more capacity than government needs, and the excess capacity would be then availed to all the ISPs at a reasonable price, so that small ISPs and big ISPs can all benefit from the submarine cables. Because as it stands, only the big ISPs are the one who benefits, and they keep the price so high for small ISPs, and the end user doesn't even know that something changed, that yes, they see bigger capacity, they see faster speed, but the price didn't change much. And this is what's only lately that it started changing. And another challenge that we faced was when all of this started, all the operators stopped their satellite capacity. They stopped it because they had both links, one through Uganda, one through Tanzania. And then came the ships. And the ship broke Easy, and it was a problem. And then, I don't remember if it was Teams or Easy before. And when Teams went down, it was very serious. So you are down on both links. And then the banking sector mainly made a lot of noise, so that as it stands now, people are going to go back on satellite, but not with the full capacity that they have, but just enough to be able to sustain the critical services. There are other activities, like I've seen IBS in the presentation of Michael, and there's another one called ESC BIN, East Africa Broadband Infrastructure Network. I don't know why the name was that way, but none of them I've seen none of them succeeding, because I think the private sector is generally faster than these big consortium to be able to find an agreement and all that. And I think I'll stop at here for the time being, and thank you.
Thank you, Eddy. So that's very interesting. So at your cross-border, at some point you have 3 players to just get from one country to the other.
Yes.
All right. So Malawi, Paulos, what's going on there?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Paulos Nyirenda. I'm from Malawi. In Malawi, I come from, well, right on the border with Zambia. So most of my uncles are across the border. And we sometimes do play the game where they have, you know, there was SEACOM here and mobile. And when my uncle connects to Adongo on the Zambia side, I connect to Malawi on the Dongo also. We can do trace route. From Malawi, it goes to Mozambique, up to Djibouti, Frankfurt, then it comes down to Namibia, and into Zambia, to my uncle right next to me. So it is real Cape to Cairo. We do this on latency time of about 300 milliseconds, so very close to what has been reported here already. So Malawi at the moment uses quite a bit of the cross-border connections on fiber. We were 100% visaed in up to February 2010, and we are very much landlocked. Again, the map there, you can see that the name Malawi doesn't fit in Malawi unless you write it upside down. So our first connection was through our incumbent telco, the Malawi Telecom, going via TDM in Mozambique, and through SEACOM. In 2010, we were seeing, just like Rwanda, quite a bit of outages on the circuit. We got a second connection through the Electricity Supply Commission of Malawi over their power lines, also towards the end of 2010. And this time, other ISPs are partnering with others from South Africa, like Gateway, to establish additional connections. So the outages that we used to see in 2010 have sort of stabilized. The telco, MTL, has 2 more connections now, one via Tanzania, and a second one, again, via Mozambique. The good thing with Malawi, one of the good things is that we have the potential to provide transit from one part of Mozambique to another. And the local telco, working with TDM, are leveraging this to make 2 cross-border connections through the country. On the undersea cable connections, actually expectations in Malawi were very high, that there would be increased capacity available, reduction in price, and possible additional reliability. The general experience of the end user is that they are not satisfied. The prices are still high, above $1,200 to $1,500 per megabit per second per month. So not very different from previous VSAT prices. And this is partly because the incumbent MTL, having installed the connections, indicates that it needs to recoup its investment, and so is keeping the price relatively high. With respect to the regulator, I think they can't do anything about it because the market in Malawi is liberalized. The regulatory framework dealt away with monopolies some time ago. The connection through Tanzania is still over a microwave link, just like my colleague from Rwanda indicated. We don't have fiber flowing from Malawi to Tanzania or through. There is a piece of land across the border where the link is through an STM1 microwave link. We have an IXP. The IXP is up. It's been up since 2008, serving the local community. It's not connected yet to other IXPs, but it's fully operational. Because of the problems that we have with pricing, with competition, in Malawi also, the initiative on regional communications infrastructure project between Malawi government and World Bank has been implemented. It's taking place right now. And the intention is to improve availability of broadband by providing competition, by installing additional fiber connections, and hopefully prices will come down. It is also hoped that the initiative will address other issues such as connections for the Marine, Malawi research and education networks. Okay, at the moment, Malawi is going through regulatory reform. So the Malawi Communications Act is under review. And what we have seen is that at the beginning, when we were drafting the law, issues of interconnection, IP addresses, domains were very high up in the agenda. It went to the politicians, and all these have disappeared. So the act has gone back to a very generic act, and issues of interconnection are no longer there. So we're having to fight again to put in place issues of interconnection favorable to the market in the act. So because of the reform, we see opportunities for improvements. We see increased consultation by the regulator. They recently invited us to discussions on IXPs, registries, and so forth. However, there is no regulatory framework for cross-border communications in Malawi, other than the fact that Malawi did ratify the Rwanda Accord under NEPAD. I'm aware that the issue of cross-border regulation was actually an issue that we dealt with in AfPIF 2010, and I think there were 3 presenters. With respect to the continent, I think that not much has changed since 2010. And the approaches that we had and the strategies that we discussed are still out there for us to work on. The fact that the Rwanda Accord has not been entirely successful needs to give us food for thought. And when we look at this, maybe we can learn from other conventions. I don't know, this year, 2012, is an issue of regulation for world communications and something. So issues of transit, issues of traffic, as discussed in other conventions, maybe we can look at the other things that deal with goods and transit. How do they deal with cross-border issues, especially for landlocked countries? We have lots of conventions. Barcelona Convention, 1921, GATT, 1947, 1994, New York Convention, 1965, UN Law of the Sea, 1982. Can we learn from these? They talk about landlocked countries. For example, Law of the Sea says, to this end, landlocked states shall enjoy freedom of transit through the territory of transit states by all means of transport. And if you put in internet into all these words, probably we could benefit from these many, many years of international negotiations and treaties. So in conclusion, I think that there's a great deal that we can do. Our regulators from the Malawi experience do not greatly understand the issues of interconnection and cross-border issues, so maybe we need to sensitize and educate them. We don't have adequate conventions for cross-border connections. Maybe it's something that we can work on. It may be that we need some form of international agreements like we did when we were working on Rwanda. It's a very slippery area. Maybe it's something that we can discuss. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Paulos. I find that very interesting with respect to the interconnection. For you, it was not such a difficult problem getting the cross-border interconnection happening. So I have a question for you, but before I ask the question, I'd like to hear from SEACOM. You've managed to get capacity to the door to many landlocked countries. What has it been like from a regulatory point of view and from also a business and interconnection point of view, getting to those countries?
Sure. Firstly, apologies on behalf of our head of regulatory who should have been sitting at this panel. However, I have been involved quite extensively over the past 4 or 5 years with SEACOM, specifically working on entry into new markets. And as I listened to my colleagues speaking, I remember all these different projects that I was actually involved in over the last couple of years, and you tend to forget those things that you achieved and more so some of those things that you failed at. Specifically, I was involved in the border crossing to Rwanda, as well as the capacity into Malawi and so forth. And I reflect on these things now. It's been so many years. But I think it's essential to, and this topic keeps coming up, even in Aidan's conversation presentation earlier on, I think it comes down to economics and pricing. Reflecting on the Analysys Mason presentation as well, I humbly beg to differ on your analysis on the cost distribution. And I'm going to choose an example which I'm sure my Rwandan colleagues and my Malawian colleague will agree with. And as Aidan had mentioned earlier on, about an STM1 is about $100 a meg at the cable station. But if you need it across Tanzania, just Tanzania in itself, that'll cost you $150. Right, so you add that up, and international, I don't see, and it's not just because I'm sitting here representing SEACOM, when you start adding up each of these transits across these countries, that's where the problem is. And then you're going to try and draw it from a reasonably small economy that's landlocked. And specifically in the case of Rwanda, you needed to cross Kenya, then Uganda, before you got to Rwanda. And then you needed national backhaul from the Rwandan border to Kigali itself. That's 3 legs of backhaul to add onto the cable station price. So these projects actually become very, very difficult to economically justify. And we've got a strategy internal to SEACOM, and we liken it to layers, the onion ring. So layers of an onion, so to speak. The closer you are to the cable station, that's the greatest likelihood of success you're going to have in developing a market. And unfortunately, it's a sad story. You know, it indirectly implies a sad story for landlocked countries. So I also think that compounding the experiences with both, specifically with Rwanda, compounding it was on the Ugandan side, the disposal of UTL to other parties, foreign parties and foreign ownerships, which then got disputed, and there was 4 or 5 management changes in the period of a couple of years, right, 2 years, which made it shocking. It was just impossible to connect the fiber across the border. On the Tanzanian side, what was disappointing was, despite promises, government handed over the Tanzanian network to the incumbent. So all of the operators, SEACOM included, felt that we would be able to get access to government's new broadband network for the benefit of the entire economy, but the incumbent was able to ring fence it and take total control. And then reflecting on Malawi, Malawi very quickly had access to transit across its neighbor. But to this day, the price points on that service is incredibly, it's probably twice to 3 times that to get to London. Furthermore, you're experiencing backhaul outages of up to 16 to 24 hours a month on that. You know, and these are the problems that, you know, SEACOM, my team specifically, tries to deal with on an ongoing basis. And I'm now going to embark on the presentation that I planned, or the discussion points that I planned, and I'll come back to some of those points towards the end of this discussion as well. But I've touched on price equivalency. You know, in SEACOM's strategy and plans, we try to get to every major city, and as close as possible, try to offer the same price to London. But as I just said, the cost base does not work on that same nature. It's the costs on that go out very quickly. But my piece of advice that I keep trying to get across to a lot of the national operators is that you've got to look at your neighbor as incremental cash opportunity, because most national operators are building these fiber routes for national needs of connecting small towns together. But we all know that that was a 1990s, early 2000s story. Middle of 2000s, we started building fiber to connect base stations together. And that's where the money was. Right? Because you connected those base stations together, you started getting rid of 2 meg, or E1s connecting base stations. You got 100 megs into these base stations, you started launching 3G, and now we're looking at 4G and so forth, and that was an economic driver. You could actually generate significant revenue. So those fiber projects began to become quite feasible. Now, when you get to the border point and you're servicing your neighbor, you know, this then becomes incremental cash to that original business case to connect those base stations together. It was not purpose-built to provide a service to your neighbor. Therefore, you could actually come up with a very different economic model to try and say, well, to say that services to your neighbor should actually be discounted compared to national services. And I know for a fact that Telkom South Africa, and this is probably the only time I'll say that they're doing it right, but Telkom South Africa offers cable station to Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe pricing at a price lower than they offer South African services. And I think that's the right model that some of the operators need to start keeping in mind. This then becomes a problem, however, if the person building the fiber between base stations is vertically integrated. And by what I mean by that is if he's running a wholesale business as well as running a retail business, because he's now going to leverage his economies of scale from the mobile business to try and make as much profit out of the wholesale. And I've seen that happen across some of the operators in Southern and East Africa as well. SEACOM itself, once again, Eddy mentioned this himself. We've learned the lesson about connecting neighbors together, and we've implemented a new pricing model to help foster greater neighbor connectivity. But I think also reflecting on the comments by the moderator, one has got to keep in mind the differences between submarine capacity and terrestrial. And you know, being involved in product development and so forth, it's key. We keep this in mind constantly. If you build a submarine system, you've got to expect 1 week, 2 weeks outage per year for some unfortunate force majeure event. But if you're building a terrestrial link, and if it's single fiber pair, you've got to expect 24 to 48 hours downtime per month. And if you've got a dual route, you can get that down to manageable, because statistics indicate that the chances of those 24 to 48 hours of downtime simultaneously happening is much less, and that will get down to 4 hours of downtime, which means that when we look at connecting landlocked countries together, you need dual fiber routes into each border point. And if you're looking to build 1,000 kilometers, you're now looking to build 2,000 kilometers. That's a very costly exercise. So having said that, though, the problem with these business cases is the belief that once you build it, the market's going to be there to pay for it. And I think in many respects, what we're trying to achieve here is to start building the dirt roads between our countries and later on go back and tar them. So, let's start off with simply getting a single fiber strand across our borders, but we've got to very quickly, we've got to keep funds aside to build a protection part in that. And, a lot of the network that SEACOM has in place, that's a big part of the problem that we try to deal with, is trying to get diversity into neighboring countries. So, furthermore, whilst you get to border points, you're actually going to some fairly rural areas, and you do not then have access to engineers, and the maintenance on those fiber routes can become very difficult. So you're not going to get engineers located, you'd say driving time, you want a driving time of an hour, so that you can get a mean time to repair 4 hours. So you need an engineer that's SDH trained, DWDM trained, has an OTDR in his bucky, as well as spares, right? Now, you're not going to get that 100 kilometers from some of these border points. You're just not. And that's the reality of what we're trying to resolve here. The other points, I just, perhaps it's a self-criticism on us all, but a big part of the problem that we're seeing is a bit of a lack of coordination, and it's no one's fault. It's not for the regulator to intervene to fix this. As I think it's for us to speak better to each other and keep each other more informed. We've had neighboring countries developing backhaul networks, but to different interconnection points. It made economic sense for the one country to go to border point A, and it made economic sense. People are trying to reduce their capital expense, so they try to build to the closest point on their network, which is not necessarily the closest point on the other side of the border. So you then have border connections that look like this. And so what you've got to do is you've got to find the middle ground to say, all right, we're both going to build a little bit further, but trying to connect more efficiently. Also, neighbors don't know what capacity requirements the other have. And SEACOM, we're in that position where we're supplying capacity on both sides of the border, so we know that country A is looking for an STM4 and country B is looking for an STM16, so we may as well put an STM64 border point interconnection in place. So we find ourselves having to coordinate that. Also, I think countries that are looking to generate revenue from providing transit services to their neighbors need to be very aware that countries or landlocked countries themselves are not as powerless as you think they are. Because we've been in situations where I'm trying to keep operator names out of it, but operators were quite bullish and quite demanding about price points and the way that they provide services to their neighbor, only for a southern border neighbor to provide the capacity at 20% of the price and on an IRU basis. So I think landlocked countries need to be negotiating with several of their neighbors to create leverage against each other. Unfortunately, you're going to have to play them off against each other. And that then brings me back down to pricing again. So a lot of the transit countries, a lot in Southern and East Africa especially, refuse to award IRU or make IRU pricing available to their neighbors. And that is a huge problem. And in fact, many of the neighbors have 1-year lease pricing and nothing more. So when you start putting that 1-year lease pricing into your business cases, right, and you know that they've got you cornered, so you're going to put in perhaps a 10 to 15% year-on-year price decline, the business case is just not going to fly. So we've been doing a lot of development work with backhaul service providers to make IRU pricing available. I'm going to speak a bit about the benefits of IRU pricing a little bit. From the perspective of the supplier, if you're making IRU prices available into the market, you're able to raise funds very immediately. So even if you provided 3-year finance on the IRU prices, you've actually suddenly got a lump sum of cash that comes in. With that lump sum of cash, you're able to go out and upgrade your network, increase capacity, improve maintenance, or even use it somewhere else. Whereas if you're collecting those funds over a monthly period, over 36 months, you just can't do anything with that money. You can't invest it. So it has a major cash flow benefit. There's an example where we worked with an operator, and the operator was state-owned, and in many state-owned environments, you're not allowed to go out and raise funding from the marketplace. So the advice that we gave to the operator was to sell IRUs available in the market, make IRUs available and sell it. We even helped them sell it to some of our own customers. They then took the IRU contract, and because the customers were credit worthy, they took that to the vendors and put it up as collateral, and the vendors then built the network ahead of any prepayments. The network, when it went live, the service was handed over to the customers handed over the cash, which went back to the vendors. So you were able to build a network with funding purely on the basis of collateral and vendor finance. So you didn't have to go to a bank, you didn't have to go to your shareholders or anything to get the network off the ground. And I think in many environments, that's exactly what you need to get your backhaul network plans off the ground. And lastly, when it comes to fiber and or when it comes to telecoms in general, I think we all would have done our jobs really well, and I've said this before, when we're taken for granted. So, 100, 150, 200 years ago, God knows how long that was, railroads were incredibly important, the postal service was incredibly important, electricity, power lines, gas lines, water connections, and so forth, incredibly important. And now, today, we take it completely for granted. And everything we do should be exactly the same. Let's get this to the point that we take the internet for granted over the next 50 years. It will be there always, and it will be there in its abundance. So rightfully so, looking at bilaterals between countries and looking at treaties and so forth, we're so quick to negotiate treaties that allow oil pipelines to go to transit borders. We're so quick to get water pipelines at transit borders, and et cetera, et cetera. Railway lines, especially across Africa. We're so quick to get all of these things signed off. Why aren't we demanding fiber pair transits, right? And there was an example where this was tried, and unfortunately it was killed. It was destroyed by the effort was destroyed by the country itself. A Southern African country had an oil pipeline that transited its neighbor, and they tried to get fiber installed across. It was possible. Technically, everybody said it was a great idea. But the oil pipeline, being essential for the stability of the country, was under the control of the Ministry of Defense, right? Ministry of Telecoms could not influence that project whatever to make progress on it. So they just shot themselves in the foot. But I think it's essential, right? You've got to negotiate fiber pair transit in the same way that you negotiate an oil pipeline or water pipeline transit, and try and get the collaboration in place. So that's my view on this. I hope this added to the discussion. Thank you.
Those are very interesting comments. Thank you very much. So our final panelists, Andreas, Sturm.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Michuki. So, first of all, before I start my presentation, like 5 to 10 minutes will take, a few things I just noted. First, if I'm talking about capacity or transport, I just mean capacity, not dark fiber links. So this is because my assumption is, or my feeling is that in Europe we generally buy and sell capacity and not going on fiber on a cross-border connection. Because building out dark fiber networks in Europe is way too expensive by having only an IP transit price by €2 or $2 or €1 or what I just heard, 23 cents per megabit. So there's no business case anymore for that. And yes, Germany does not have a landing station. So just that you don't forget. But isn't an issue. We don't care. We are lucky. And so it must be worked somehow because DE-CIX has 480 plus customers from 52 countries. So cross-border interconnects must work somehow. So it's a good example. And what I found interesting is taking internet for granted. Yes, we do. But the discussion that we've taken is on what speed. 700Ks, 2 megabits, 10 megabits, 100 megabits, 50 megabits, access speed at home. That is the next step here taken. Okay. going through this. Thank you very much for letting us, sharing our thoughts on the cross-border issue here. And thank you very much, Michuki, for making this happen to be here. And thank you for your attention before, and then hopefully you don't fall asleep. So that's myself. I'm the head of business development. I joined DE-CIX in 2009. I do work as a corporate sales manager on the so-called dark side. I sold IP transit. And now on the bright side, I'm selling peering. I'm very happy and lucky. And the picture was taken at the end of the JP Morgan Chase Corporate Challenge run. And you can see the stuff. There's all DE-CIX people, and it's half of us in Frankfurt working. There are 16, so we're around 30 people making all this happen at DE-CIX. So interconnecting next door, so cross-border to a neighboring country. No problem. Pas de problème. No hay problema. It's generally no issue anymore, just interconnecting. Even setting up POPs isn't really an issue outside next door country. For example, one of the networks I'm talking to, he said, okay, we just had a good connection to Sylvester, and he made anything happen for us. That was excellent. So, and this is based on the peering relationship that these guys have with Sylvester. Sylvester is the CEO of the Polish Internet Exchange. So, I'm true, right, Freddie? Okay. Okay. But if you're going one step further, like in former Soviet Union republics, it's OMG. Oh my God. Exactly. It's unbelievable. Sure, it's a language issue. So in these kind of countries, English or French or Spanish or whatever isn't very common. So if you don't have a Russian-speaking colleague on your side, you're pretty much lost. Then if you're trying to get some help from the embassy, for example, doesn't work. Customer clearance. It's unbelievable what they do. Nothing. And if you're trying to motivate them, it could be not the chewing gum anymore or chocolates. Different things. And even if you manage to go there, then you have to go to set up a legal entity and apply for a license, even to do business there with the locals. And this is taking about 2.5 years now. So they're pretty much of giving up making business down there in this kind of country. And it's unbelievable. So he was really like the picture is saying always, when he's calling his colleagues in the former Soviet states, he was like, oh my God, I'm not talking anymore. So it's still an issue, cross-border. It's not that painful that you, especially as a landlocked country, suffering from. But it's still an issue on a high level, complaining on a high level, so to say. And so as we are, as an IXP, heavily relying on good cross-border connections, what can we do to even provide our services or making our service available somewhere? So what we decided is we go where the customers are. So we talk to them constantly. And at the end of the day, we have 51 or 45 networks from Russia connecting to DE-CIX, 51 networks from the eastern part of Europe. And because what we're always doing is, oh, there's the picture coming? Yes. So what we're doing is we are hosting events like AfPIF, the European Peer Forum, the Global Peer Forum. We do many things to enable people to talk to each other. And there are carriers and ISPs around from different countries. And we're trying to let them talk to each other and negotiate to each other and make deals and business and everything. Now this is what we learned getting people together. And as you can see, at the end of the day, it's always ends partying at a bar. This is like we experienced yesterday evening, closing the bar. But this is how we do it. And as we are not starting competing in the carriers world, we were asked, okay, Andreas, Why don't you set up a POP somewhere or an IXP somewhere else in Moscow or in Bulgaria or even down in the US? And we say, it doesn't make any sense for us to interconnect these kind of shops because we don't jump into this carrier business. But what we do is making our services available outside of Germany by introducing a reseller program for ISPs and carriers. So they can resell their existing capacity. So if you're already connected to an exchange and you have spare capacity left, sell our services. That's how we somehow get around the cross-border issue from our point of view. Yeah, that's pretty much it from my side. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andreas. Good. So I think we've had a very good introduction and background to a lot of what's going on in the different areas. And one of the things I wanted to mention before Andreas came on to speak is that I looked at Germany in view of, as we were looking at who to put on the panel, we wanted a country in Europe that doesn't have a landing station and get to learn from them. What have they actually done to get so many people connected in the country, in one particular region from different countries? And having them on the panel from an African point of view, in view of the challenges that we have, what can we actually learn and do differently? And your suggestion at the very end is, I think, is very interesting for the exchange points in the room. It's very interesting for those who are carriers are looking at providing interconnection, going beyond or rather looking at how to resell capacity into places where they have access to. So going on, next we would like to go into the question. I'm sure there are a number of you who have burning questions. So I also have a couple of my own, but I like to make sure that I give the floor first an opportunity to ask the questions before I intervene with mine. Do we have any fast takers with questions? Okay.
Kevin from ISOC. I'd like to know from Malawi and Rwanda, what is the price of per megabit of 1 megabit? What's the price you get?
Well, it depends. It depends on how much bandwidth you're buying. As currently, the price is about $280 per megabit when you're buying an STM1 at least. For those who are buying less, I think it's around $700. If you're buying a meg or 5 meg, it's about $700. But we expect to have it lower to 100 and something in about 2 months.
In Malawi, it's a little bit higher. It's between $1,200 to $1,500 per megabit per second per month.
Okay, I have a question for Andreas. Do regulators in Europe, and specifically Germany, have they played any role, or have they stayed out of this completely to make interconnection happen or cross-border interconnection happen?
They stayed completely out of the interconnecting business, which helped a lot to set up cross-border or even interconnects within Germany and cross-border connects. The regulator jumped in when it comes into the last mile regulation. Because, of course, Germany has a dominant market player, it's the Deutsche Telekom. They still have the most portion of retailers. So to get access to the internet, the regulator jumped in and said, okay, make a fair price to resell this last mile to ISPs and competitors. This they do. But they didn't jump into the saying regulated price on interconnect fees. For example, on peering or on and these kind of stuff. So this is free.
Michael, do you have some?
Yeah, just to add, I mean, the one unique thing about Europe is the European Union is trying to create a common market, and so if there were any in laying the fiber, they of course, you know, as a common market, they control both sides of the border for all European markets. So I don't have any specific examples, but if anything came up of problems between the regulators in two countries, they can always go to the EU and resolve that as a common border. So that would facilitate building the capacity in the first place, and then Andreas is right that the regulators aren't going to get involved in the costing. But that's the advantage of the EU, that they control both sides of all the borders and are trying to create a common market. And you can see that best in the recent roaming regulations, that the EU decided that roaming rates within Europe were too high, and so they could force all the countries to lower those rates. And that's very difficult to do if you don't control both sides of the borders, as we know, because very few cross-border roaming rates are regulated for that reason. So I think that's the advantage of the EU in laying fiber and getting access to both sides of the border.
So that gives me an interesting question, and please raise up your hand so that somebody can come to you with a mic if you have a question. We have regional regulatory associations. I think in Southern Africa it's called CRASA, and would there be an opportunity for these kind of organizations, because it's an association of the national regulators, where the regulators can actually go and discuss these issues of cross-border interconnection? And is that happening in Southern Africa? I know, Paulos, maybe you may have an idea, but I know we have other regulators in the room, Lesotho, ICASA. It would be good to hear whether there's discussion on cross-border interconnection at the regulatory level for association at CRASA. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Martin.
this on? Yeah. So I want to try and get a reference point from the various speakers. We're just talking about the cost of moving bits across the border. Can we also compare that to the cost of moving commodities in general life, or even luxury goods if there's a tax associated with that? Where does moving bits across the border relate to that? Whether it be food commodities or fuel or just anything that somebody can add to this conversation. Because I'd like to sort of know, I mean, are we talking about cost of living that is quite expensive in certain countries, which therefore means that some of these numbers may not be out of whack? Or let's prove that they're very much out of whack. Either way, I'd be intrigued to hear the answer from anybody.
Okay. There's a hand up here as well. Anybody on the panel willing to respond to Paulos?
Yes, I can speak on that.
Okay.
I think that with respect to Malawi, I think that the cost of the internet is a little bit outside the normal cost of living. I think if you look at price of 1 liter of fuel around the region, price of 1 liter of petrol, in Malawi it's roughly between it varies about $1.2, $1.3 per liter, which is probably close to what the other countries have. But the price of the internet in Malawi is 2-3 times more than the pricing for the internet service is a little bit outside the normal cost of living price.
Okay. I had seen another hand with a mic. Okay.
I just want to come in to respond to your question on whether CRASA is coming up with like your cross-border regulations. In terms of the internet, We haven't moved that far, but I know for the mobile telephony, we have a project that is
It's okay.
It's okay,
Yeah.
okay. We have a project called Home and Away Roaming, whereby we are trying to come up with a common regulation for the SADC region to see that if our roaming agreements, even our roaming prices are almost similar. So I think in the long run with internet, we might move that way.
And just as you have the mic, is there any policy right now that exists within, let's say, South Africa to, with respect to cross-border interconnection?
No,
so
not yet.
Is it regulated or non-regulated?
For now, it's not regulated, for now.
For now.
But I think, bearing in mind that there's going to be the telecoms conference where issues of internet are going to be addressed, we'll see how that turns out, whether we might need to regulate the internet, and if so, what areas of the internet we might be able to regulate. So for now, there's nothing.
The reason I was asking that is, Paulos mentioned...
There's a glitch in the matrix.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to ask about that is because it appears that from South Africa going to Malawi, the interconnection, which largely comes via South Africa and Mozambique, seems to have been less problematic. And I was curious to know whether it's because there was regulator involvement or there was no regulation involvement. And that's why I was asking the question from that point of view, and it appears that no regulation seems to have helped Malawi, but it looks like Suveer.
I've worked in 2 cross-border, 3, but 2 that work successfully in South Africa. I was into Namibia, and then the other one into Zimbabwe. And like, there was no real regulatory involvement or requirement. It was just an agreement between the 2 parties. Fortunately, in our situation, South Africa owns the bridges across the borders. So the Thames Roads Authority provided permission for the laying of the fiber. It was installed and connected, and that's it. It was really a very quick process. The delays in getting the roads agencies permission. Bridged any other interconnection. So the other challenges in the markets had to connect at a different location, but it made sense for them because those were the closest points on their network. So I think on the South Africa side, it's actually working reasonably well.
Mike Silva.
Suveer, sorry, if I can just on a point of correction, that's obviously because you're interconnecting in Zimbabwe with somebody who has a cross-border license. There is actually a regulatory requirement from the Zimbabwean side.
Yeah.
So obviously whoever your partner was over there had the necessary permissions. If they'd lacked those permissions, you wouldn't have been able to. Or if, for that matter, they don't like you, you won't be able to. And I can tell you stories of cross-border crossings in Zimbabwe with the requisite permissions where I just can't get approvals on a particular bridge or piece of infrastructure simply because they don't like the operator concerned.
Yeah. No, look, correction, I was speaking from the South African perspective there with respect to Violet, but you're right. I mean, on the other side of the Zimbabwean border is a different story. Yeah.
Okay.
I noticed the 2 countries are both landlocked, Malawi and Rwanda. Both in similar position, literally. Yet your pricing is 5 times. The one is 5 times more than the other. How does that work out? Where did those numbers come from?
Paulos, let's give him an opportunity. Yeah. Paulos, please.
Yeah, maybe I can comment on that. I think that in Malawi, the system has no government intervention. In other words, as of now, until the Regional Communications Infrastructure Program with the World Bank comes into play, the telco is basically free to charge what they want. I think that's probably one of the differences. There is very little competition, and there is very little that the government is doing about it. So those are some of the factors that are there. Maybe that can help.
The retail price or the wholesale price for operator?
For mine was a wholesale price. Yeah.
Your price was the retail?
That's what an ISP pays to MTL to buy, yes.
If I may add on this, we noticed when we first started, TTCL was monopolistic and very expensive in Tanzania. And we just benefited from the fact that there was a lot of competition in Kenya and Uganda.
Yeah.
And the prices in Kenya and Uganda were quite low. Actually, at the beginning, the crossing from Rwanda to Mombasa was 5 times less than crossing from Rwanda to Tanzania. And then when I spoke with, I was also handling the RSAIP in the past. I spoke with my colleague in Malawi. They were so happy with the price of Tanzania because Tanzania was so cheap. And I told him, don't tell them that they're cheap. Because they were 5 times more expensive than what was there. And what we did to help Tanzania reduce, actually there was no even IRU price in Tanzania. It was, the best you could get is a 3-year lease. And there was a tender. And the tender was buying an IRU. It was, I think, the first IRU for long. And we put it into 2 lots. 1 lot through Uganda, 1 lot through Tanzania. And Tanzania understood that if they don't play it right, we could block the lot from Tanzania, and we could even ask for redundancy through Uganda, Kenya. So Tanzania then kind of opened up. Yeah. So I think this is also what is helping us. Mozambique, I believe, is really charging very high prices there.
Yes, yeah. I think that's the issue in Malawi. We're going via TDM. I don't know if TDM is here. And the comparison with the microwave link through Tanzania, the difference is very big. But our main route right now is through TDM, through Mozambique, and that's quite pricey.
Okay, we have Mohammed Rudman.
Yeah, if I may add to this, I just want to find out, do we have someone here from Chad, Niger? Because I would like to know their prices, because in Nigeria, from the port sites, that's the southern part of the country, the internet bandwidth is about $200 to $300, $500 per meg. But in the northern part of the country, within the same country, is like $2,000. Why is it so expensive? And if you have someone from Niger or from Chad trying to tap out of it because he has to tap it from the northern part of the country, of course it's going to be much more expensive because the terrestrial link within Nigeria itself is really expensive. And one of the major issues I think they've not mentioned here is sabotage. As you lay your fiber, apart from the right of way you pay government, people will be behind you overnight digging out the fiber. In fact, a telecom company says that, look, to forestall this, we actually give contract to the commissioner of police in the state to dig the trenches. Because if they are aware that police are actually doing this, most likely they will not come behind and dig out the cables. So, and because of this sabotage, people have to find alternate routes. And in providing alternate routes, that makes it more expensive. So it depends on which country you are tapping from. So if you are tapping from Nigeria, I really think you find it more expensive, especially in the northern part of the country, those countries that are landlocked, neighboring Nigeria from the northern part of the country. I think this is my thinking. Thank you.
Fiona? Oh, sorry. Okay, as Fiona gets the mic, Professor Kashoda.
I just wanted to follow up the question. It looks like in Europe the solution was the EU. And I just wondered, why isn't the solution in Africa the AU? At least one of those COMESA organizations, regional bodies, the many regional bodies that are talking about trade liberalization. Why isn't that the solution? I know there are some AU representatives here, including the ones that were, yeah. Okay. Could they address that?
So a question that has been posed. Yeah. Okay, Andreas, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, reply.
Okay.
It sounds like the EU is the problem solver, but sometimes it isn't. From our interconnect peering perspective, the EU, they introduced a so-called BEREC working group, and they started looking in our industry with no clue what we are doing. So, and the intention of a regulator is always to regulate. And as our ecosystem works smart and perfectly and cost efficiently for most of the parties or stakeholders, the EU wouldn't in this case be the solution. It would be the party who would stop us from evolving and then moving into Web 3.0 and whatever. So it's very difficult, and sometimes EU is helpful on law cases, but regarding economics and ecosystems and internet, it's I'm not sure if this is the solution we want to see jumping in our system and telling us what to do, with whom to peer, what is the price of interconnects, what is the price of peering, or I don't know if I guess you are aware of that 99.9% of all peering agreements are not written, just a handshake, email, whatever. So if this changed, all the administration would then, the costs would increase because you have lawyers inside. Anything smart things happen now because it's so easy to interconnect and to peer with the other. If then the regulator regulates and put paperwork in it, the fun is gone. And the business probably is gone too.
Michael, you have something to add on that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, with, they're at the higher levels, but when I made the reference to the EU, I was really talking about building the infrastructure in the first place. And the basic point is that the European countries have given some measure of sovereignty to the EU to have control over the borders or on both sides so that they could smooth if there were any problems, and I've asked all my colleagues and they couldn't come up with any. Typically, actually, the problems are the cost of the right-of-way within the country, but very few problems crossing borders. Once you've got the infrastructure in place, I agree at the higher levels, there's no need for a regulator, and to my knowledge, it hasn't really been done. But just for smoothing the way for building, there's a common market, and that includes these cross-border issues.
So I like the thought because I understand where Professor Kashoda is coming from. And I like the idea of not also having the regulators involved. But in Africa, we have this thing called the no man's land. And I don't know how many panelists here, especially those from Africa. I know, Paulos, you have the no man's land in Malawi. You have the same in Rwanda. I have the same in Kenya. I don't know about between South. No man's land. Now, it's 600 meters of piece of land that forms the boundary, the border between the countries. Digging across that to put any infrastructure is, in as much as you'd want to say it's hands off for regulation, that part needs lots of bureaucracy to actually know who is supposed to dig across it. I've heard stories of where there's what they'll call a manhole or a pop on either side of the immigration office because both countries could not agree who needs to build the fiber across. But it's 600 meters. So agreeing over who builds infrastructure across 600 meters has added third parties, as Eddy pointed out, and that in itself involves lawyers and legal people and a whole team to try and get the infrastructure built and lots of other efforts to build it. And if that part cannot be smooth enough, then it is difficult to address the issue of cross-border. And I think at that point, I feel regulators need to be there to say, look, we need to come up with something. And I'm seeing Fiona's hand going up. Do you want to say something, Fiona?
Actually, just to pick up from what you've said and to go back to what Eddy had mentioned, within the East African region, we have what is called the East African Communications Organization. that in 2009 began to put down a proposal to establish what they were referring to and continue to refer to as the East African backhaul system, so that then the landlocked countries such as Rwanda and Burundi, who are members of this organization, would benefit from the submarine cables. And that was one of the factors that contributed to the price in Rwanda coming down more than anything else, because then the regulators had to agree with the operators on an arrangement that would be viable for operators in terms of business. And yes, the operators did agree that they would set up national backhaul systems that would then be interconnected to enable the landlocked countries enough options with which to carry traffic to the submarine landing stations, either in Mombasa or Dar es Salaam. And so that process began. And as a result, we saw the Tanzanian government and the Kenyan government come up with have tenders to establish national backbones that are run either by an independent party or the government. Different structures were set up. And probably, I think the challenge that Eddy has highlighted is something that, again, is going to be revisited, because I know that during the meeting we had this year, those issues came up. The issues of how to cross the no man's land were raised during the SEACOM meeting, and regulators pledged to look into it and to facilitate. And as we talk, I think the experience should be different. If not, I know that any regulators from within that forum who are seated in this room would be able to explain where the challenges have been and why that is not happening, especially on the Uganda part, because the Uganda regulator was part of that agreement, and there is a signed document to that effect. So then, I would just like to mention that at the end of the day, I think the activities of the regulator within the East African bloc have significantly contributed to opening up the borders for the cross connection, and have also had an impact on the price, because operators wanted it to be an open access process that allows them to, as many cables, as many connections to come in as possible on competitive rates, so that everything is driven by market forces. And so far that has been able to contribute to the experience that Rwanda is having, but it can be better. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Suveer, did you have something to add on that?
I'm just, I'm just surprised, because I do understand the concept of no man's lands, but the way that we've dealt with it before is the roads authority would have the rights of way, and they would have done that many years ago. So you're just asking for permission on an existing right of way across the no man's land. Are you saying that in your experience you've pretty much gone across virgin soil into no man's land, where there's are you not using existing roads, or you're just going through the bush into these no man's lands? Because then I understand the situation is a little bit different.
Well, the no man's land, at every border crossing point, because they define the areas where the road will be and where structures can be put in the no man's land, because neither government essentially owns that piece of land. It's a boundary point. Now the question is, if infrastructure has to be built across it, right, both entry and the exit point, first, who owns that? Who owns the infrastructure? Who is going to secure the infrastructure? Because it doesn't fall under either government's responsibility. And so that in itself becomes a national security issue. It becomes an immigration issue. It becomes infrastructure issue. So the government agencies that you actually have to talk to get approval, and that's in both countries, to actually build infrastructure across it, makes it difficult. That it's easier to actually do it over wireless and WiMAX. That's why, as Eddy mentioned, these WiMAX at the border points, is because crossing over wireless is straightforward, right? But having to do it where somebody has to dig the ground and put something below is a different issue altogether. So I've heard it many times mentioned, and I was hoping you've also...
Well, no, my suggestion would be is just build it, and the person most offended will contact you, and then you ask for permission.
Okay, there's a question at the front.
Hi, I guess one of the things that came to my mind as I was hearing this discussion is the word regulator. Is that a positive or a negative sounding? It sounds negative. Regulator means to restrict. It's the policeman for the telecom industry. You go complain to the regulator and they will get a stick. Is there a way that the government's buying power across the countries in Africa could be used in a positive direction, such that they themselves could be buying internet access in enormous quantities, provided that the providers go into each of these countries around Africa? Is there a carrot that would allow people to have a financial incentive to build into these landlocked countries?
Paulos.
Indeed, this is the model that RCIP is using. The World Bank project is trying to make access more available and more affordable by using the government buying power. So they buy the capacity in advance and hope that the one who is laying the fiber will then provide it at an affordable price to the rest of the community. This is an initiative in Malawi, and it is hoped that when it becomes operational, it's going to increase capacity, increase competition, and use the leverage of government to bring the price down.
Michael?
Yeah, obviously regulators, if it's positive or negative, is in the eye of the beholder, pretty much on every decision that they take. I mean, one thing that I've seen with regulators around the world is that often the government is the telco, and that a good regulator can act in ways that benefit the industry, but not necessarily the government, because the government is getting revenue and wants to keep value in the telco. So that a good independent regulator can actually liberalize to the extent of their powers and take actions that the government, as it were, might not take, because the government is trying to protect its investment and its revenues from owning the incumbent. So it really depends. Obviously, again, as we were talking, as they move up in layers, and as we're starting, somebody mentioned Wicket, there's cases where the regulator would have a negative impact when they get involved in areas that have been working just fine. I mean, you know that, obviously, from the peering. But for developing infrastructure, for liberalizing, the government, the regulator as an independent body can take actions that can be very helpful for laying down the infrastructure.
Eddy?
Well, I like the way that regulator is seen to be sometimes negative, but I think what I've seen, and as Fiona mentioned, I believe that the reason why it was easy for us to cross the border is because the regulators have been meeting often and have been peering by themselves. And when I asked them, how did you do, what happened? They said, no, we just sent an email, we sent a letter, they replied with a letter. And I think if two operators get to the border and the regulators are positive, it has to happen. It has to happen. But, well, in some cases, I believe it can be more complicated. And the only place where I think regulators should really play a serious role is when we have operators with interest in both countries. If they have that, it becomes complicated because you might find the fiber getting on one side of the border and not being able to cross on the other side because this one here can only connect to his partner on the other side. That's where I think regulation could play a role. But, well, it also depends on the muscles of that operator. Because sometimes operator backs louder than the regulators.
So you're proposing a regulators peering forum?
They do, yeah.
Okay. Any other questions we have from the floor? Oh, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sitting here as a regulator, I wanted to really understand to what role the regulator is supposed to have in this cross-border traffic connectivity. Yes, and I get a number of thoughts coming through, but I think the common one, which I seem to agree with, is that the regulator, maybe it will help for us to all understand that the regulator in every country has jurisdiction in that particular country only that he is or she is established. You don't have any powers, any regulatory powers outside the country that you are established. I think we should have that understanding. This is why, in order to promote that peering or comparing of notes, we come up with these associations, CRASA being one here in this particular region. And those associations, they just come up with guidelines. They don't come up with directives, as Michael was saying in the case of EU, which I think it was a long process for the EU to come up with that structure where the EU could come up with directives to encompass all the countries in Europe. So the issue of whether we should, as regulators, come in and promote cross-border connectivity, I think what is important, if a regulator in its own jurisdiction has liberalized the market, and in particular, the international gateway, allowing connectivity across the borders to different multiple players, I think that is really what is essential for a particular regulator. And the issue of whether there is now going to be connectivity with another party, that should be left to the operators who are to negotiate SLAs amongst themselves to connect with each other across the country. And the issue of no man's land in my country, I have my colleagues here, if they're aware of any challenges, I don't think there is much of a challenge in that particular matter. But however, if there is a challenge as far as spillage of frequencies across the border, as in the case of Lesotho and South Africa because of the proximity of the towns along the border, then it's where we will engage with each other as regulators. That is ICASA in South Africa and the LCA in Lesotho, to see how we can address such issues. So the last point I just wanted to make is that regulators have a very positive role, contribution to make to the sector. Regulators are there to level the playing field, to promote the sector, to open up the market, and to ensure that there is competition for the benefit of the consumers. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's a very strong comment I've seen there on, please give the mic to the gentleman there, Mark Tinker, just before you go on, Mark. So from what I'm hearing from the regulator is that their key role should be to liberalize the market, especially the international gateway. So international gateway, that means whether it's submarine, whether it's cross-border, whether it is satellite, if the more players you have, the more opportunities you have. So I think going back to the earlier presentation, which was done by Michael, where he was showing some of the challenges of those countries, it would be good to see what number of the number of gateway providers that those countries actually have. They could say liberalized, as we said. I do remember there's a time in East Africa we had liberalized market, but we still had only one international gateway provider. So it's could mean something else. So how many gateway providers do they actually have so that they can also
Thanks, Michuki. Mark Tinker, SEACOM. Just, I think, for feedback on the comment that Mr. Regulator made. Yeah, I think technically, yeah, the regulator for a specific domain would have sovereignty in that domain, which obviously makes sense. However, based on the examples that have been given by East Africa already, I do not necessarily think that there are hard and fast rules about how the regulator should work. If there's an opportunity to go away from the norm and engage with neighboring regulators in facilitating that kind of relationship between the countries, I do not see how that would be a bad thing as such.
So, challenge to the regulators, going outside the norm. All right, do we have any other questions or comments on the floor? No? Okay, so Paulos, last comments.
Yeah, I think just a comment, I think, on the issue that was raised with the AU. Actually, I like the comment. I think that one of the things that is missing on the continent is data on the networks. And collecting this data, making it available, is probably one of the things that is missing if we compare it to the EU, for example. So that, well, when they say you present the data, it's a name and shame game. So people are able to see where the disparities are and where there is need for action. I think we are missing adequate data on the continent.
That's a good point. So I'll start from the end. Andreas, as we close, what's your final comments?
My final comments. It's been 2 fantastic days for me to learn how the African internet ecosystem is working and understanding much more that the cross-border is really an issue, that pricing is a truly issue. So if you can't get around this interconnection pricing, nothing really will happen. So this is, you really need to get around this high pricing on interconnects. This is probably the biggest issue.
Do you think there's a role exchange points can play in bringing these interconnects down?
Pardon?
Do you think there's a role that internet exchange points can play to bring this cost down?
Well, it's difficult. Generally, exchange points are layer 2 just layer 2 switching fabrics. We don't do anything regarding interconnects than just interconnect our customers to our fabrics. So, but on the other hand, as we went to Russia and talked to like 50 to 60 potential customers, we're just making up a market on transport. So when I remember like 2 years ago, I talked to an interesting party and he said, wow, I have to pay $25,000 for a 10G link from Moscow to Frankfurt. And so the business case doesn't work. So 2 years later now, it's about half of this. And now he can consider really connecting to DE-CIX. So I don't know if this really is force enough, if you can create an awareness or can create some kind of a need among a lot of people, bringing them to a table and then chasing constantly the network operator to make a affordable pricing. If this works, generally it does.
Okay, thank you. Paulos, final comments?
I think that price is the issue for us, yeah.
Price is the issue. Yeah. Eddy?
Well, I think regulation is important, but as it has been said from DE-CIX, the regulation should only be there when there is a need. If possible, if the links can be established without that, it would be better. And another thing that I mentioned, that I didn't mention, was one thing that we've seen in East Africa. Though there is cross-border connectivity, sometimes traffic goes to London before coming back to East Africa. And I believe that I've tried to think through, operator seems not to understand, but maybe a regulation, a stern regulation on that one could help, as saying you don't allow the traffic within a region to go, even when the cross-border connection is done.
Okay. Michael?
Well, I think that Mr. Posholi from Lesotho put the role of the regulator very well, and I know from working with him that they put that in practice. And I think the importance of a regulator with a clear vision and view of promoting competition is to provide regulatory certainty. I spoke to a client yesterday who doesn't have your optimism, and he said we would never consider building fiber because we just don't know how far we'll get down the road before somebody decides that they want more money out of us, or before they tell us that we don't have the license and then shut it down, and we're not going to literally sink money into something where we don't have certainty that we're going to be able to complete it. I think the other thing with the common market approach is that clearly the common market had nothing to do with telecoms, but shared interests of creating a larger market on the business side, and that there were a lot of cross-border businesses that would push and benefit and have demand for cross-border infrastructure. And I think that one of the things in the countries that I work in where the incumbent clearly has a strong role is I'm always amazed that the companies aren't, that the banks, that the companies that rely on telecommunications aren't playing a stronger part as a counterweight. Because the government is not just making money off of telecoms, they're trying to promote ICT for other businesses, for their own use, for their citizens. And I always think it's important to get them involved, because telecoms ultimately at the end of the day is maybe 3 or 4% of the economy, and getting a counterweight from the banks, from the big users, that we need access to cables, we need to get there and we need it cheaper, otherwise we'll move, I think is very important, and you don't see much of, and otherwise you're in this bubble where the incumbent can always call up the Ministry of Finance and say, stop the regulator because they're about to hurt our interests. You need someone else calling the Ministry of Finance and saying, well, what about us? And I think that's important, and not just in Africa, but it doesn't come through enough.
Okay. Suveer?
I have a different view on the evolution of Europe. I don't think it was so much the fact that the European Union existed as it was the fact that Europe as a landmass is a lot smaller, the countries are a lot smaller, and the deregulation happened a lot faster. And if you look at Germany as an example, it's a massive economy, high population, it's a large country. And that, for those reasons, I think it was able to dominate and take advantage of fiber transiting its neighbors. I think it would be very different if you remember Swisscom and if you remember Belgacom and the trouble that they went through. They, in fact, merged their entities to create BICS at one point. I think if you look at the smaller European countries, there was a very different story. Having said that, though, the role of the regulator is clearly to increase competition. And the second point with reference to Europe is Europe has a very large and abundant availability of dark fiber. They have a dark fiber market. Now, a dark fiber market is easy to create in a small landmass. Right? It's more difficult for us to create here in Africa. But I think the second role of the regulator is to try and foster and create that dark fiber market as well, because it enables landlocked countries to get access through their neighbors. The third point is just, once again, I think we've got to think very differently about communications and the rights of landlocked countries to fiber transit. And that has to be taken up a level above to treaties with their neighbors. And I think that's the third role of the regulator.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we've come to the end. Oh, somebody from the floor. Okay, it's a lady, so we'll give her the opportunity. Okay, the mic, please.
Thank you. Going back on the issue of institutions, what role regional institutions can play.
Please use the mic.
Can you hear me?
Now better.
Okay. Just going back on the issue of, say, regionalizations or regional institutions that can drive ICTs throughout the region, Africa. What role does, I know there was a gentleman from NEPAD this morning. So what role does the NEPAD ICT Commission play in terms of issues around this whole cross-border connection? And does the NEPAD ICT Commission have the muscle to enforce to enforce cooperation between the countries, different African countries.
Okay. I have somebody from NEPAD in the room, so I'll give Dr. Noella, an opportunity to respond to that comment. If somebody could take the mic to the far end. There, lady at the far end.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much to the person that asked the question for recognizing that we are in the room and we do exist. I think you've asked a very interesting and very pertinent question in terms of what is the role of NEPAD and the NEPAD E-Africa program as far as these issues of cross-border networking and the regulatory aspects. In terms of our mandate very clearly is to facilitate and to coordinate. And so to answer your question very simply, we cannot enforce, we cannot muscle, but we can advocate and we can help in terms of where there are issues and where there are specific engagements that need to be made between countries. We can act as a facilitator in terms of getting the issues across to the relevant policymakers and decision makers and trying to find a resolution. In terms of, for instance, what was being talked about, which was the Kigali Protocol, that is something that came out of NEPAD, and that is something that we still continue to work on and work with, because we still believe very strongly that that's the only way that we're going to get something happening at a government or regulatory level that's going to actually try to level the playing field. So we cannot force people to do anything, but we can advocate and we can basically carry the message along to the relevant policymakers. This is your ministers and your regulatory agencies, and basically act as a broker on behalf of all the stakeholders concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so we'd like to close this session, and I have to say this. I'm not a policy guy, and I'm purely technical, but I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, and thanks to a very good panel that we had this afternoon. So I'd like to invite you, all of you, to recognize and appreciate our panel today. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have one more session to go, which will be very short and brief. We'll be getting updates after this from on IPv6 and as well as from EuroIX. We'd like to see what's happening elsewhere with respect, very much related to interconnection. And in addition to that, tomorrow morning we'll have the second session under this theme, which will be, after having looked at these particular challenges, what opportunities are there, because there's those operators who've, despite all these challenges, are building infrastructure, interconnection, cross-border points. What are the opportunities they are seeing, and what else exists out there that we don't know? And you'll be quite surprised by seeing the session tomorrow in terms of what opportunities actually exist for operators when it comes to cross-border. So for now, please go for the coffee break, next 20 minutes. Let's come back at 4:30, and then we'll have the session before we go for the gala dinner later tonight. So, but you have to be here to know where the gala dinner will be, so you have to come back. So thank you very much, and enjoy the coffee.